Welcome to the Always Better Than Yesterday podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Hartley. This podcast exists to equip and inspire your heart-centered leadership. Every week, we bring interviews with some of the greatest heart sets and mindsets on the planet. I hope the heartprint of our time spent together is that it creates new possibilities for you and all those you come into contact with. If you'd like to explore what we could make possible for you, then head to abty.co.uk/connect and book in a free 30-minute call to begin our journey together. I just want to express a huge amount of gratitude to our sponsors, Exhale Coffee. I have been a big fan of Exhale Coffee since meeting Alex and the team back in 2022. Exhale is the first coffee to be sourced, roasted and lab tested specifically to maximize its antioxidant and anti-inflammatory potency. An independent lab test has shown that 1 cup of Exhale Coffee has the same antioxidant power as 1.8 kilos of blueberries or 55 oranges. I'm a huge fan, and Mrs. H loves the decaf, especially because she knows that Exhale use the mountain water decaffeination process, which uses only pure glacial water from the highest mountain in Mexico and no nasty chemicals. Simply head to exhalecoffee.com/ABTY for your special offer. And lastly, before I introduce this week's guest, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It would really help us leave a greater heartprint on this world. On episode 290, what a joy it is to welcome Mimi Nicklin to the podcast. Mimi is the internationally best-selling author of Softening the Edge and Empathy at Work. She is also the founder of the world's widest-reaching empathy training and engagement platform, Empathy Everywhere. She is an experienced executive coach and a well-known thought leader advocating for the global movement to create more empathy in the world. You may not know this, but there is an empathy deficit. I hope this conversation goes some way to bridging that gap. It's episode 290 with Mimi Nicklin. Mimi, welcome to Always Better Than Yesterday podcast. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me.
You and I have already had a podcast-worthy conversation. We just didn't record the first one.
I know, but that means the second one's going to be even better. I'm sure of it.
Always better than the last conversation. It's right on brand.
There we go. Well, there you go. Look at that. Natural cohesion.
100%. You and I have a heart for empathy. I think empathy is a real core aspect of what we talk about here at Always Better Than Yesterday, which is heart-centered leadership. So I'm really looking forward to diving into a topic that's close to your heart and the impact that you're doing, because I think one of the things with heart-centered leadership is it's not like heart only. It's not heart or mind. We don't have to choose. But I think what you do really well is you bring the mind's critical understanding of what empathy is so that we can be more practical in both growing and deploying it. I think many intuitive heart-centered leaders say, I'm just empathetic. I'm just an empath. Whereas actually, I think what we're going to have in this great conversation is actually, that's available to everybody. And I am really looking forward to learning more about what it is that you share with the world. But before we do that, help us understand a bit about what your heart and mind.
Oh, my heart and mind. Well, as you touched on already, Ryan, my whole life is actually centered around creating empathy and doing exactly what you just said, which is giving people a little bit more understanding and hopefully energy and inspiration around what empathy is and why we need it and why the world needs it, So we do have a huge deficit. It's called the empathy deficit. That is the lack of understanding in our world. And when I discovered that, which was really back in 2018, it changed my life. I never expected to be doing this work. I had been in corporate for a long time. And it was discovering this deficit of what is a pro-evolutionary skill set that we all need and all have, that really led me to write my first book. I've just finished my third, and to get up every day and just talk and write and travel the world talking about empathy. So, that really is who I am. And I think what's interesting is that people so often talk about, I don't know, work-life balance or kind of versions of self. But there are no two versions of me, Ryan. There's not like Mimi the mom and Mimi the professional and Mimi at home. There's just me.
Yes.
And this is my whole life.
Yeah, if only we were all such integrated humans. I think I used to work at the police. I did 15 years in the police, and much of the attitude there was like, leave home at home. Like, it's
Mm,
almost like cut parts of your life off because you are needed to perform. Like, I exaggerate for effect, but you get the sentiment. It was,
mm,
the idea of, your personal life. Um, wasn't welcome. It wasn't
mm,
entertained. If that was a barrier to you performing, then it needed to be resolved rather than part of the leadership understanding of how do I
mm,
get the best of people when they come through that doorway.
mm. I think for unfortunately, for many organizations, that's still the case. And I often, write or talk about this concept of integration over balance for that exact reason, because I think
Mm,
for as long as we are desperately trying to balance,
yeah.
especially I'm obviously, I can talk from the point of view of a parent and a mother. It's, as far as I'm concerned, it's impossible to balance. You'll never get there. There's never going to be one day ever when everything perfectly balances. And so that striving to do that, it's true, right? That
Yeah.
striving to do that, I think for so many of us, of course, I can only talk as a mum, not as a dad, but it creates so much pressure and anxiety because we're constantly striving for something we're never going to reach. For me, I look at integration, and how do we do that? Even if you're in an organization that is saying, like you just said about the police, keep your home at home, how do you integrate different areas of your life and just really acknowledge the fact that that is a choice? And, I always say to my team, you can only do one thing and be somewhere at once. So
Mhm.
if I am talking to you now, I'm not with my daughter. I made
Mm,
that choice. This hour I'm giving to you, not to her. That's not about balance, it's about choice. I'm integrating my time. So I find that
mm,
recognition is heart-centered. It's self-centered, and I mean that in a positive way,
mhm,
not in a negative way, in terms of understanding how you want to pass your time, how you want to grow,
mm.
and where you want to put your energy. I know it's not always that easy, especially in the corporate world, but I feel quite lucky that I'm managing to get it right.
I understand the sentiment. What you mean is it's not selfish, because I think it's about awareness, isn't it? Because I've often said to
Mm,
people, it's like a better me is a better me for you. And if
yes,
I have
I
a
love
greater
that.
self-understanding, greater self-awareness of my energy, or what's important, what's lighting me up, what I have available within me
Mm,
to give other people, the more I understand the self, the more I'm greater able to understand another. I interviewed a guy at the start of the year, and he said something along the lines of, we come to the world from the reservoir of self-discovery.
ooh, that's deep.
Yeah, it is deep, isn't it? But I think when we're talking about empathy, I think there's this idea that you can't meet anyone any deeper than you've met yourself. And I
Mm,
think that's a real paradigm shift for leadership, because, my day, not long ago, leadership was Hollywood. It was rank, it was position, it was status.
mm,
Whereas what I think you and I are talking about is just a set of behaviors. It's a way
mm,
of being, as opposed to a title. And for us to really get to the depths of what I think we're talking about, which is to connect and truly understand, and to lead people, I think we have to be on a journey of cracking open this as leaders, which is,
yeah,
actually, what do you mean I've got to do that as a leader? No, 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 no. I'm just really good at what I do. Like, I don't need to go into this thing that I've locked away for many years. Does that resonate
yeah.
with you?
I think it does. And I mean, when I hear you and kind of paraphrase perhaps what you're saying, or at least what I'm hearing you say, is there's a really big difference between who you are and what you are. And
100%.
as a leader, and you have a title, I don't know, vice president of sales, whatever your title
Yeah,
is,
yeah, yeah.
that is what you are. You are the vice president of sales, but that doesn't need to and shouldn't necessarily define who you are.
Mm,
And therefore, you were talking there, Ryan, about behaviors, but it can also be values. The values that you bring into that role, the way that you do things, the
mm,
things that you will and won't stand by or for. Um, and I think, sort of you touched on that a little bit about when you spoke about the past. You said, leadership was versus perhaps where it is now. And that really resonates with me, because I think this conversation is changing really fast, and long may that last,
mm,
into this new sort of understanding of what leadership is. And, you know, today I'm talking to you from Southeast Asia, but had we spoken 2 days ago, I would have been in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I said to them this week, they asked me, what did I think leadership was? And I said, well, you know, if you Google it, you're going to find, you know, 1,000 definitions, maybe more, maybe 1,000,000. But for me, it's really very simple. To lead, the definition of leading something or someone is that someone is following, because you can't lead if there's nothing coming behind or alongside you. And I think what the world is understanding now is that if you want people to follow you, to choose to follow you, it's not going to be because of your job title. Nobody ever followed anybody because of their title, right? They followed them because of respect or trust or camaraderie or joy or a million other emotions. But job title wasn't one of them.
Because they want to, not because they have to.
Exactly. Yes.
So how did you end up in this world of being an empathy expert, speaking on stages and writing books? Because I think what you said at the very start was that you were in business.
Yeah, I was. I mean, I was in the corporate world my whole life. I was in advertising. My father was in advertising. I always wanted to be in that industry and to stay in that industry. And for a long time I did. You know, the majority of my career, I traveled the world with that industry, and I still have a great respect for it. But in 2018, everything changed, really. I moved to the Middle East for the first time with a CEO role, a regional CEO role. I moved across the world and I took over this job. And let's just say, if I'm being very sort of safe or politically correct, that the job wasn't quite what I expected it to be, or what they had told me it was. And financially and operationally, that business was in a really difficult place. And the honest truth, Ryan, is that I was entirely overwhelmed. I had no idea how to turn that around. I had come out of very corporate roles where I had, you know, huge finance teams and procurement and just leadership all around me, people on the journey with me. And I ended up in this role that needed a lot of transformation and fixing. And I hadn't been trained that way, and I had been trained in the system, and this was a very different ball game at the time. But as with all things in life, you know, when you look back on them, you know exactly why you were put there and why that happened. And in that process of overwhelm, I went to meet a business coach, and she was asking me about my leadership style. And at the time, I was talking about intuition and being an intuitive leader, a people-led leader. And then, Ryan, she asked me a question that changed my life, because she said to me, Mimi, is it intuition or is it empathy? And I remember at the time thinking, no, it can't possibly be empathy. But when I left that meeting and started researching much more about what this meant and could be, I discovered the empathy deficit. This huge gaping hole that was creating, you know, chasms of gaps between people all over particularly in the corporate world, that I had never been aware of. I understood that over the last 30 years, we've lost 48% of this skill set, a skill set, Ryan, that literally keeps us alive. You know, so we are talking about the survival of the human race, as well as obviously doing well in workplaces and leadership. And I couldn't believe that nobody was talking about it. I, you know, at that time, 2018, really nobody was. There was, I don't know, maybe 3 books about it on the market. Now, fast forward 5 or 6 years and everything's changed, but it wasn't there when I started. I think I was, you know, all alone in this conversation until very recently. And yeah, now that's beginning to shift.
It's quite damning, isn't it? 48%. It makes me think about what are the conditions. If this is such a, I'd like, I use the word natural carefully, because I think it's in our human nature to be this heart-centered way. I think sometimes we have to learn what is taking us away from our true nature, and I think, you know, it makes me think about 48%. What are the conditions that we've created in this lifetime? We talk about evolution being like a progressive thing. I think, have you ever seen that meme where there's like the progression of the monkey to the man, and then the last one is like, nope, turn around, we got it wrong.
Let's go back.
Yeah, let's go. Yeah. It makes me wonder, like, if we're losing that at a rate of 48%, it makes me wonder, what have we done? What have we created that is so far against our nature? What are some of the barriers do you think are to having true empathy and understanding for people?
I think there are three, to be honest. I think the first is high stress, and
Mm,
that is due to neuroscience. So for
yeah.
any of your listeners that know what the fight or flight response is, fundamentally, simplest of neuroscience possible in less than a minute. But when you're under very high stress or anxiety or fear or danger, your
Yeah.
brain works in a different way. It releases different hormones into your body. And quite simply, it moves blood, energy away
Mm,
from the parts of the brain that we do use for empathy, which is the prefrontal cortex.
yeah.
So when we live in a state of stress, which of course we are in the world, in some countries, so the USA, for example, 43% of their population is living with daily anxiety. 43% of a huge country, 300 and something million, right? So we have an anxiety and stress issue in the world. And that does reduce our empathy, both physiologically, literally the brain is responding differently, but also
Mm,
because we behave differently under stress. Low time is another one. And of course, if I asked your audience to sort of, put your hand up in your world today, if you've got low time,
mm,
nearly all of us would, because we're all constantly fighting for this elusive
mm,
resource, which is more time. And the reality is when we have low time, we have less time, quite literally,
mm,
to either care or master or create time for connecting with others. We're running, and that, of course, if you think of yourself, you imagine yourself for a moment, sort of being in the office perhaps, and you're running for one meeting, and then you've got to pick up something at reception, then you've got to get to a lunch date, and then you've got to get back to that meeting room by 2 o'clock. There's very little time to sort of stop and hear what someone's saying
mm,
and really understand
mm,
their reality. um and then the third, I would say, unfortunately, is fear.
mm,
And for most of the world, we are living in a state of fear on some level most of the time. So, whether that's sort of grave danger, and we're talking about political instability, war, famine, terrible
mm,
things, or it's just a state of, many things that make us unconsciously uncomfortable, whether it's, I don't know, some people are petrified of AI, and robots taking over the world. Some people just don't understand what's going on with their governments. It could be social structure. It could be economic,
mm,
realities. It could be, some of these mass redundancies that we're
mhm,
seeing all around the world all the time. So I think stress and time and fear are all far, well, the stress and the fear is high and the time is low.
mm,
They're out of kilter. And to really master these skill sets, and perhaps to your point, Ryan, of going back to where we came from, if you look at how we evolved, these three issues, maybe the fear, because if you look back at cave times, right, we were pretty scared of saber-toothed
mhm,
tigers. But the other two were things that appeared and disappeared. You would have
mm,
high stress, but it would disappear again. So that's
mm.
my theory. I think that, to your point, what's made us so out of kilter, modern life has made us so out of kilter.
Yeah, taking us out of that moment, taking us out of, and I think as you're speaking, like a great leader is not with the absence of stress. Like
Mm,
we're not empathic. We don't have empathic leaders in this world because they're the ones that have somehow magically got rid of all the stress. I think they're able to somehow transform that, transmute it, because I think Viktor Frankl has this wonderful quote. It's like the between stimulus and response, there's a gap, and in that gap lies a choice, and in that choice lies your freedom. And for me,
ooh,
that yeah,
that's good.
and for me, it's to say, okay, there's a stimulus, there's a stressor,
Mm,
but there's also a gap between your stimulus and that response. And for me, for some people, that gap's really small. It's like there is no
yeah,
gap. There's just stimulus and response.
yeah.
And I think for great leaders, for great empathic leaders, they will make that gap as big as they possibly can. And I think that
Mm,
starts with having self empathy, understanding how do I respond under stress? Or why is that stressing me? Like, what are my needs? What unmet needs is that possibly scratching up against? How do I give myself what I need? Self empathy, so that I can then be available to other people. And
mm.
I think that's such a a process of self mastery that I don't think we ever get to the peak of the mountain with.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I have a sort of a few thoughts come to mind. I think yes, I agree with you that there are some leaders that have just, they are empathic leaders, that they've mastered it, it's habitual for them. We also know that, and I call this reverse empathy, but there is intrinsic value to us in empathizing with others. So fundamentally, when you empathize with others, you also get joy. We see that in neuroscience as well. So, you know, when they feel understood and connected, they benefit, but so do you. So yes, there is that. On the second point, what's interesting, Ryan, just for this, you know, sake of open conversation today, is
great.
I have always said exactly what you've just said. So for the last 5 years, I have always taught people that self-empathy comes before empathy, because if you don't understand yourself, A, what you need, value, and you know, helps you grow, but B, what are your biases and judgments and realities and experiences? You need to have that mastered in order to empathize with others. Now, I haven't, you know, miraculously changed my mind. I think that is logical and it makes sense. However, interestingly, I've been doing some research recently into empathy in infants and children, because I'm trying to sort of track where some of this comes from. And we have just found data in the last month, really, that starts to show, well, maybe not, because actually in babies, they learn to empathize with others well before they empathize with themselves. So that might tell us, I don't have enough data yet to know, but it might tell us that it could work both ways, because as human beings, when we're very small, we are able to understand the pain and anxiety and discomfort of others before we are able to recognize that in ourselves, because our brains haven't developed enough to be self-connected enough to know that we have, you know, pain or stress or anxiety, but we can intrinsically sense it in others. And that's obviously been proven with babies who cry when other babies cry, and studies like that type of study. So yeah, I mean, again, I don't disagree that knowledge of self has to come first, but isn't that interesting that there could be both ways?
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that, because I really felt that in my heart. Like, it's just such a wonderful reminder of our true nature. Like, we have this true nature. I think sometimes as we grow up as young adults and adults, I think so much of life is not built to support our true nature. And you know, so I think in my last podcast we talked about how it's not about being childish, but like childlike. And I think a big part of that is like to be kind, and I think it's to be curious and to be compassionate. And I think children seem to be able to do that without. I guess what we have as adults is we've got previous experiences where we overlay the current experience with, oh, that must mean something. We bring the past and we apply it to a current situation, whereas, you know, children must just be able to access the present moment without any additional meaning other than what's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the brain is designed to do. You know, the brain is designed to work more or less on autopilot, more or less in an immediate response, by pulling from memories and experiences and past realities in order to protect us and help us grow. The brain only has really one set of instructions: to keep us alive and to reproduce. Fundamentally, that's, you know, what humans are here to do. So it will always default to those two options, which, as you said, means that you're not always able to analyze through some of those, for example, memories, you know, from children. And I often use my daughter actually on stage at the moment, because she happened to make a really great video clip, which I think explains as well. So I show it, and I show it because when she talks in that video clip, and it's completely unscripted, she walked in on a shoot and said, "Mummy, can't I be on video too?" And I was like, "Sure." We didn't even, you know, brush her hair. And it's on my Instagram if you want to see it. She came on, and I asked her live on camera, you know, what does listening mean? And she says, well, you know, listening means that you understand other people. And I said, yeah. And, you know, what happens when we don't listen to people? And she says, well, then you feel sad and you think that person's not your friend, right? She's 6 or 7 now. So she's able to instinctively, perfectly, clearly explain, we listen because we need to connect. And when we don't feel it, when we don't do it, we feel terrible. You know, children know that we're supposed to connect. They want you. That's why children strive so much for their parents to listen to them. You know, mummy, look at me. Mummy, see this. Mummy, they want to be seen and heard because they know that's how we survive. But as you said, as we grow and stress and money and adult life experience bias, and by bias, I don't mean, you know, all the stuff that the media talks about. I just mean bias to life. You know, I feel safer when I feel I should eat because, I
Yeah.
feel I should live here because. These are biases that we all have. It's not always an unconscious bias against a certain group or anything like that. It's
Mm.
just choices that we make due to experience based on our own self-knowledge and the social well-being. So I think you're absolutely right. I think children know how to do these things, and it's us
Wisdom.
adults that forget.
Yeah, and that always brings me hope. Always brings me hope, because if we get if we I say education loosely, if we get the nurturing of our young people right, these people are going to become our next leaders and
Sure.
CEOs, and so that gives me hope that there is a generation coming through. I've heard you talk about a multi-generational team. And actually, here's the
Mm,
challenge, because you say that they're going to demand, not just want, but demand listening-led leadership. Like,
mm.
for anyone that's hearing that term for the first time, listening led leadership, what does that require of us to get our head around and start
Mm.
embodying?
Look, I think the honest truth is that I use that term for one simple, well, no, maybe two simple reasons. One is that it does what it says on the tin, right? And we can unpack that a bit, but it is fundamentally about leaders who know how to listen before acting,
Mm,
acknowledgement over action. The other is that if I went around the world talking about empathetic leadership, I would lose half of my audiences. And in empathy for my audiences, I want to make sure that I have a term that everybody feels they can understand and respond to. And the reality is, with the word empathy, first of all, it's wildly misunderstood. People
mm,
think it's being nice, people think it's sympathy, people think it's compassion, which again, we can come back to if you feel it's a
great.
value, but it's none of those
Yep.
things. Um, and I want to have a term that feels strong and simple and
Mm,
approachable for, men and women, senior and not, for everybody. So that's why I have this term listening led leadership. And as I said, it really just refers to leaders that understand the power of listening, which is fundamentally the backbone to empathy. So when we talk about empathetic leaders, what we're talking about is leaders who are able to take the perspective of other people. On the far end of that, you may find empathic leaders who can feel the feelings of others and all these types of really far at the other end of the rainbow realities. For most leaders that are embracing empathy, they're fundamentally embracing data, human data, the ability to take the perspective of
mm,
others. Why is your team behaving the way they are? Why is your supplier of 20 years
mm,
suddenly not renewing, their contract with you? Why is the person you promoted doing less well after the promotion than before? It's data, Ryan. It's about understanding
mm,
people. And what we know is that when people feel that you are listening to them, when they
mm,
feel that you value their opinion, that you see the world as they do, even if you disagree, because empathy is
mm,
not about agreement and it's not about judgment, simply about understanding. We
mm,
see endless metrics improve: 23% higher profit, 17% higher efficiency, 64% higher engagement and motivation, 48% higher levels of innovation. I mean, I could quote data all day, but there are endless performance indexes that improve when
mm.
we reconnect the people with their workplaces and with each other. So, listening led leadership is the ability to embrace all of that and simply listen to people, understand the data in the room from the people that you're working with,
Mm.
and use that for the benefit of everybody.
What I'm about to give you is a completely hypothetical situation, because, I am a perfect heart-centered leader. There are no flaws in my character. I am absolutely 100% a perfect heart-centered leader. So what I'm about to say to you is hypothetical, right? When I'm listening with my wife and I give the social cues to say I'm listening, like, uh-huh, 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 she'd be like,
Mm-hmm.
what did I just say then? Like, shit. So there's definitely a bridge between listening, hearing, and understanding. And I think that's some of the pathways that we're on as leaders. It's yes, okay, listen, but actually to really hear the heart of someone. Sometimes that's beyond words. Sometimes that's the way it's said, or sometimes it's the way that something wasn't said that you really start to hear. And I think that is something that we really learn as we continue to just have a commitment to just understanding in a deeper way than even just listening.
Absolutely. And I think, those first two words that you use, the difference between listening and hearing,
Mm.
is a really good way to bring that to life for people listening in today to us, because to hear something, unless you have a physiological issue with your hearing, to hear is a natural occurrence. If I drop a glass now, you will hear it, right? We can hear it. We can hear the sound of glass smashing. It's a natural occurrence. To listen is an active skill set. And that's, you know, what you're referencing when you're talking to your wife and you're going, you might be nodding, whatever it is. And you may be listening. But if she's saying, what did I just say? She's probably picking up on the fact that you're a little distracted. Or, you know, your eyes are going somewhere else, or that noise is not active. It's somewhere, you know, your brain is somewhere else. And that is the reality in workplaces all over the world. I mean, I'm sure for your listeners, if you put yourself in a situation, you imagine being in a meeting, perhaps, when someone is talking about a change. They're talking about, we're going to have to change the timeline. We're going to have to call the suppliers. We're going to change the, you know, the production line. And in your head, you're already thinking, well, I'm going to have to tell her that won't work because I already spoke to the factory and they said they need 2 weeks. And all these things are going on. You are no longer listening. You are hearing. You can hear the words of the person in the room, but you're listening to yourself because, of course, the brain can only process one voice at once. And at that case, it's your voice. When you're saying, well, I'm going to have to tell them that and I can't do that and I'm going to, your brain has switched to you. So you are no longer listening. And the way that I often ask people to consider that, Ryan, is to question themselves. Am I listening to reply? Or am I listening to understand? And that one simple question can quite honestly change relationships at home, relationships at work, relationships with your children. Question yourself how often, if you have young children, toddlers particularly, toddlers to kind of 6 or 7, children talk about all these crazy things that's in their mind. How often are you really listening to what they're saying to you versus just hearing them? And then question yourself whether, if at 12 years old, you say, oh, you know, my tween has changed so much and they never listened to me and all of these things. And then you have to ask yourself, well, did you listen to them for the first 12 years of their life? Were you listening to them? Or were you just hearing them and, you know, giving them advice or moving them through that? And then wonder why at 12 they stopped listening to you. Who did they learn that from?
Yeah, well, that's the ultimate accountability, isn't it? And that's the paradox, isn't it, of the leadership dynamic, the leadership paradigm we have is, you know, many people feel like to be an effective leader, they have to be at the front, they have to be the one speaking, they have to be the one deciding. And I think it takes a commitment to go, actually, do you know what, that's a fallacy. Like, I don't have to be the one to figure it out, to be the one speaking, to have all the answers. Yes, there's some responsibilities I will bear and I will take accountability for those decisions 100%. But I think there's it's the very reason I don't over prepare for these interviews, because if I'm sat here going, right, question number 9 is, I haven't heard anything of what you just said.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I do a lot of panel discussions, and again, Saudi Arabia a few days ago, big panel, you know, lots of pressure, and every other person on my panel is doing that. What's the questions? Can you just remind me to the moderator? You know, and they come to me and they're like, do you want to talk about this? I'm like, no. They're like, well, do you want us just to quickly? I said, no, thanks. And they said, why? And I said the exact word for word, same thing, Ryan. I said, because if I prepare for them, I'm not listening to you. I'm listening for either what I expect you to say, or I'm worrying about what you didn't say, because question 3 was actually this, but now you've asked me something else, or you've asked my partner on the panel something else. And then again, my brain has gone somewhere else entirely. So I feel very similar to you. I think to really be able to listen, you have to be in the moment with someone or someone's to actually really activate that. You know, listening is an intentional, active process.
It is, and
I
if
resonate with
anybody,
that.
and I think for people to go back to listen to the start of this episode, because you did that back to me, you were like, "What I think I've heard you say is," and then you were like, "Here are the 2 points I think I." So you're clearly you've mastered this to the level of unconscious now. Like you're doing it because it's part of who you are now, right? And I think that's the point we all got to get to, right? We've got to practice so that we turn the 5% into the 95% subconscious. And it's just an expression. We just do this stuff because that's the reps we've done, you know? And I think, yeah, you're a living example of that. And part of that was paraphrasing. Okay, I think I've heard what you said. Let me just play that back to you so you can, if I give my verbal summary, you can go, oh, no, that's not what I meant. And what we do is we put it in the middle, and we both, I guess what we're trying to do is this communication thing is to bridge perspectives.
And that's why I always say that empathy, the definition of empathy, I mean, there are many versions, but the one that I always put on a slide is that empathy is perspective taking. Exactly what you just said. That's all it is. It's just about, taking that perspective. And the reference you just made, and you're right, I don't remember saying that to you about what I heard you say, but that is, as you said, it's about paraphrasing. And what I call that is confirm and correct, which is a really nice methodology that anybody listening can use. And basically what that is that when someone finishes speaking, you just repeat back to them. I mean, not identically, but, you repeat back to them the last sentence or three that you heard them say. So I would say, Ryan, what I heard you say was you would like to move this conversation on and talk about something else. And what that gives Ryan the ability to do is either say, yes, that's exactly what I said, Mimi, let's move on. Or, no, actually, Mimi, that wasn't quite what I said. What I said was, if this happened, I might like to move on. So either way, in that confirm and correct approach, the person you're talking to feels heard, and you are sure that you are listening, that you really heard what they wanted you to hear and not what was in your head. And when I told that to a CEO in banking in New York about 6 months ago, off air, he told me, do you know what, Mimi? I think having spoken to you today, that perhaps I've been mishearing 70% of my conversations for the last 20 years. And I was like, no stress, you're only the CEO of one of the world's biggest banks. But, because I think, when you bring awareness to this, people are like, oh, have I been listening? And funnily enough, in a workshop just 2 weeks ago in Asia, and when it was very funny, but it was also very poignant. I'm doing this workshop and this lady puts a hand up and I say, yeah, what would you like to add? And she says, well, I just want to tell you something. And the whole room's listening. She says, Mimi, I'm 48. And I just realized I've never listened to anyone in my life. And of course, the whole room laughs. She laughs, I laugh, but she's serious. She said, no, I know it's funny, but I mean it. She said, I just realized I'm not listening to my husband. I'm not listening to my children. And I'm definitely not listening to my team. So it was that moment, you can just see it in her face where she's like, oh gosh, this is not something I've been doing, So it's something you have to really sort of focus on.
And there's grace for that, right? And I think most business people, leaders, entrepreneurs, like they want to work with their own ideas, right? True change begins at the point where we choose it for ourselves, right? And I think that's what happens when you allow people to connect with this realization. It's like, oh well, I can't change the last 20, but I can only imagine the ripple effect that will now change. Because like we have almost this midpoint in our life where we go, here's life up to the point where everything changes. And then the second part is infinitely different. But if you took away the first part, the second part wouldn't have such context.
Yeah. And I agree with that. I think, for many people, we get to somewhere around like late 30s, early 40s, and people begin to panic because they're like, oh my gosh, I'm 40, right? This is like this big thing. But then you realize that statistically, or maybe not statistically, I should say scientifically, we are actually children, our brains at least, until 23. So of your adult life up until 40, just under 25 years of it, you were a kid, actually, which means that only 15 years have been you being an adult, like actually working out what you want to do with your life. Do you want to be a policeman? Do you not want to be a policeman? Do you want to change the world? Do you want to work in politics? Do you want to be a mum? I don't know, all of these questions that we have. You've actually only been working on that for 15 years. So by the time you're 40, God willing, you hopefully have another 50 years. That's a lot more adulthood to come than we've had. And I think we often don't think about that, but I find that really empowering when it comes to thinking about, future facing behaviors and perhaps listening better, building relationships, approaching leadership differently. Just because you've done it one way up until now doesn't mean that there's not great opportunity to do it in a way that's even better going forwards.
And if only someone wrote a book that included longevity within their book around how might I get longevity.
Imagine that. That's exactly why I've written my third book about that, around longevity, but in three ways, Ryan. In your body. So, why does higher levels of empathy, belonging, connection make us physically better? You can eat all the fruit and run all the marathons you want, but statistically, if you're lonely chronically, you will die 8 years younger. You're far more susceptible to many of these diseases that might eventually harm you. But also in our leadership. So, why it is that leaders that are connected, that listen generally last longer, do better. People like Satya Nadella, who's the chairman and CEO of Microsoft. And in our relationships, the first chapter in that part of my new book is called How Many Marriages Could We Save? Because how many could we save if we listened better, and actually were able to use those listening skills that we were born with to reconnect, in context and in social reality. So yeah, I think it's such a phenomenal space because we don't think about it. We don't think about the fact that having friends is good for your health. So yeah, it's a phenomenal space.
And I understand that there's some tips for your mother-in-law as well in the proverbial mother-in-law, not your specific.
Not my specific one, obviously. But yes, particularly because I live and have lived in Asia for nearly 20 years. So my whole adult life, I've been in the East. And of course, on this side of the world, multi-generational families and sort of family engagement is far more prominent than it is in the West. And I think some of those relationships that we marry into can be the most complex to use these skills. Because, of course, again, they're very emotional. They're very emotionally driven because you have to be with your family. You don't always choose them. So, yeah, there are definitely some tips. Let's leave it at that.
Get the book. Which book is that? And what's the title of the book? And where can people get that?
Well, they can't get it yet because it's not out, but it's called The Connection Prescription. And it will be out in early 2025. So, yeah, keep your eyes peeled.
The Connection Prescription, brilliant. Share it with us when it's out, and I will make sure that everyone has a link to it. One of the things that I heard you talk about before is that we are more alike than we are different. And I'm going to make a confession, right? I get that awareness when I look at my dogs. It's a strange thing, but I look at my dogs and I'm like,
I love that.
So I'm like, they've got eyeballs and they're looking at me, and they've got noses and they've got mouths and tongues and lungs and heart, and I'm like. And I've obviously just had a complete spiritual awakening by looking at my dog, and I'm like, how alike I am to my dog. But if that's how alike I am to my dog, then there's going to be infinitely more ways that we're more alike as a human being. And I think some way that the way the world is, the way that culture is, the way that we classify different people, we put each other in boxes. And I think we need to break down some of that categorization in a way that we remember our humanity, our shared humanity.
I mean, absolutely. And that's why I talk about that so often. I tend to finish most keynotes with that statement for the exact reason that you just said, because it's very easy for us to go through life contextualizing ourselves into different groups. Of course, these groups exist. They could be religion or age or gender or, motherhood or, I don't know, various groups. They exist. But in so doing, we often create those gaps between us, and especially when there's low empathy. So we know that when empathy is low, all of the isms, whether that's ageism, racism, sexism, nationalism, anyism, go up. Because the less understanding there is, the more me versus we there is. And again, that links back to my point earlier around fear, because human beings, when they feel under pressure or fear, they will revert to like. And again, that goes back to the brain's pure mechanism of survival. I am arguably safer with people that eat and live and sleep and behave like me because I'm, fitting in the group, and we're safer in groups. So there's very rational reasons for that. But yes, we are more alike than we are different. At a basic level, we all want to be loved. We all want to be connected. We all want a hero. We all want some joy and all of these types of things. So I think it is a really important thing to remember, particularly in times that we're living in where that segregation and isolation is so high. And, I had a moment, Ryan, last night. I was at a concert. I was at an Imagine Dragons concert. It was phenomenal. And I don't know them well. It's not like I'm a huge fan. I mean, I'm barely a fan, to be honest, but I loved it. But I had this moment.
Did he have his top off?
He did.
Yeah.
He did. But he put it back on, because when he took it off, I was like, does he know he's in Malaysia? Right. And that's probably not cool in Malaysia. Right. And I don't know if someone told him or not, but he did put it back on quite quickly. Anyway,
empathy in action.
There we go. He did speak a bit about his own struggle with mental health. And what I really liked was two things. Number one, he spoke about listening. He was talking about going to therapy and stuff, but he also just said to the audience, thousands of people, find someone to listen to you. And I, was super happy to hear him say that at large. but actually to the point of we're all more alike than we are different. It's a very, very diverse audience in Malaysia, you know, religious background, family, culture. There was many, many different people in that audience. But when he performs, they are one. We are one, and you can feel it, you know. And I think concerts, soccer matches, or football matches, you'd say in the UK, are exemplifications of that moment.
Yeah.
That when we are together,
Yeah,
we are better in so many
100%.
ways.
I've had a number of interviews on this podcast where I've come to this belief system, which is, so I've interviewed people from the Heart Math Institute, which talk about how when we share heart coherence, which is when our heart is in sync with a group of people around us, we become a new entity. In Christianity, that's called the body of Christ. I think in other religions, it's the web, spider web. Like, I think it's this understanding that as human beings, human spirits, human souls, if you believe that way, they're interconnected. We're all part of this web and we're one, right? And I think that if we're talking about that monkey and that man evolution, I don't think we've stopped as an evolution. I think the next evolution is when we become a group, when we become humanity as an organism, as opposed to just humans. I think that is our next evolution, when we start to operate as a group, as one. And you get that in a crowd, right? You get that sense and that feeling
You
of
can feel it.
the self dissipates into we rather than me. I think was what you said earlier, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is our natural state as evolution. But I think the gateway and the pathway is heart. It is empathy. We can't think our way into oneness because it makes no sense. You and I are clearly separate. We're in different countries. You look different to me. You sound different to me. My mind perceives we are different, and that's the very thing I need to understand what I am, because I am not you. But that's the limitation of the mind. We're not going to get there to this state through the mind. I think the heart is the bit, the empathy, the compassion, the oneness, and the love that, without being too hippie about it, I think is the very catalyst to then great teams. Because, you know, when we're corporate, right? Organizations, a group identity, team identity, you know, if we really want to tap into this sense of something big, you know, belonging to something bigger than ourselves, then I think this is a perfect gateway to be able to do that.
Yeah, and you know, all the data shows it. I saw some new data again last week just around the core values that drive performance the most consistently over time. And it comes out as solidarity or culture, you know, people being together under a shared purpose, under a shared goal and vision. So as you said, you know, when we connect as humanity, when we connect as a species, it doesn't matter how different you are in the workplace, because that central calling calls to everyone, and then you come together. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. And let's hope that's exactly where we're going. I think the science is there, the data is there, the awareness is coming. And again, small story, but I had a example of this last week in the Arab world. I don't speak much Arabic. I certainly don't present in Arabic. And a older gentleman, very senior leader, came up to me at the end and he said to me, listen, I listened on the auto translate headphones. So I couldn't understand what you were saying, Mimi, but I could feel what you were saying. And again, when you talk about cultural barriers, there's a lot between a Caucasian Western female and an Arab man in, you know, fully local dress. There's a lot of visual differentiators between me and this gentleman. And yet there he was saying, I can't actually even understand you, but I can feel what you are trying to say. And that is hopefully, Ryan, where the world is going, right? When we can start to come together in that ability to feel the direction that we should be going in. And it is happening, not at a large enough scale, but we'll get there.
So in terms of how people can work with you, you run your own business. Obviously, you're author, speaker. Maybe just give us a bit of an understanding of why people, or who should connect with you, and what they can get, or why they would be compelled to have a conversation with you.
Wow, I don't know if that'd be compelled to have a conversation, but I'd love to have
Let's
one.
just assume that there are people 100% compelled.
So yes, I mean, as I've touched on, I spend most of my time speaking. So I am, I guess, a keynote speaker, although I never really call myself that. But yes, I spend a lot of time speaking. I do a lot of workshops and work with organizations in this space in terms of how do you bring more empathy into leadership and cultural transformation and that type of thing. And I'm very active on social media. So I truly believe that the more the world talks about empathy, the more empathy the world will have. So I get up every day to do that. So I think if you are interested in this conversation or understanding more about it, they can come find me on Instagram or LinkedIn or YouTube, and you will find endless content about empathy in so many, many veins, whether it's with artificial intelligence or in parenting or in leadership or in community action or in religion. Just what does it mean and how do we use it and why should we use it? And I hope that, I hope that that's creating an impact for people. Certainly it's growing. This never was a business. It is, it is now a business. I have teams, but this was just a passion, Ryan. This became me rather than the other way around. I often feel like, I don't know, empathy chose me, to be the kind of spokesperson for that out there in the world. And today it keeps me very busy, but I do lots with women. I do lots with social work. I do lots for free. And I do also a lot in the corporate world. So that's what I'm doing.
Elizabeth Gilbert in the book Big Magic talks about the idea that ideas are in the ether, right? Ideas, they're not personal. They don't belong to anybody. They simply require one thing, a willing human participant. And I love the way that you just said empathy chose you, but it also required you to accept the mission should you be so brave and courageous to receive that.
Yeah, I think that's really valid. And it is courageous, not empathy per se, but I think for anyone listening who has a passion that they want to follow, or any kind of calling that they want to do more of, courage and consistency. But courage is probably the number one skill, because there are many easier ways to build a career and a passion.
100%, yeah, it's exposing, and it requires us to come face to face with vulnerability. And for generations where we've been conditioned out of vulnerability, it's it requires courageous leaders to go first. I have a client, great friend of mine, in the US. He's a chief people officer of a big kind of organization, and he is very heart-centered. He is talking about the things we're talking about in a corporate setting. So this, even just I can see his face. This conversation alone is going to be like oxygen to those people, those great people who are leading in this way. For me, when I was at the police, I believed in this style of leadership with my whole heart. I just wasn't seeing it with my eyes. So when authors and speakers speak of a style of leadership that I can imagine, it's like oxygen to those people. And, we've got generations of, young people entering the workplace who this is just the most natural thing in the world to them. That actually we will become their lifeline, we'll become their oxygen. And the one thing I really love is they will be empowered to become their fullest expression of this work.
They will.
Yeah.
They will. And long may it last.
It requires that we stick around for another 10, 20 years where we just become the sages of the, the wise industry kind of go-tos, but yeah, let's just outline the books there just for absolute sake of clarity. Name the book titles, and what's in it and where they can get it.
Yes, so my first book is called Softening the Edge. That is a global bestseller and is available, everywhere on Amazon and all those things. And that is the first book I ever wrote about leadership and transformation. So how you use it. There's a lot of case studies. There's a lot of personal storytelling in there. It's not a very dry leadership book. It's got quite a lot of stories in there. My second book is called Empathy at Work, but that's only available in India. So if you're from India listening, you can find it. The rest of you, unfortunately, that was written for India in India. And the third book is called The Connection Prescription. And as I said, that will be out in 2025. But meanwhile, you can find me at www.empathyeverywhere.co or at Mimi Nicklin, basically everywhere on the web.
So 4 years ago, we had, I'm not going to mention the word because I understand that the algorithm suppresses anything that mentions that couple of year period where everything shut down. But we were forced into a global lockdown
moment.
A moment in time, right? We were forced into one of those. Well, I just wonder if it's just the thing that makes me think everyone's now prescribed connection. Go and connect. I just tell us about the world you imagine when everyone has had their connection prescribed.
Oh gosh, I mean, I think the first thing that I imagine is that we would overcome loneliness, which is such a huge burden on our lives and our health and our relationships and everything else. I mean, statistically, 52% of us are lonely. And this stat is awful, but just, you know, to throw it out there, 300 million people don't have a single friend, Ryan. 300 million people, right? So in a world where everybody had a connection prescription, that would not be the case. We would be more connected. We would be able to overcome loneliness. It certainly wouldn't be at 52%. And in some countries, Australia, the Philippines, it's way higher. The highest burden to our healthcare system currently is chronic loneliness, not heart disease, not diabetes, not cancer, but loneliness. So we would be able to repair our healthcare systems. And with that, all forms of social injustice, prejudice, and gaps would be, you know, would be improved. Because when we are more connected, we can empathize more, we can understand each other's realities. It would shift behavior en masse. So I think if we had our own connection prescription, yes, we would be healthier for sure. We would obviously be more in cohesion with our communities, our workplaces, and our friends and family. But we would also just generally have a better world. And if you believe in the ability to find joy, and I specifically don't use the word happiness, I think we would all find far more of it, because as you've said very clearly in this show, Ryan, you know, we are better when we are with other people, right? That is a reality. So we would also be more joyful.
Yeah, and I think the one healing aspect of having a higher faith is that acceptance comes for just being who you are, not putting your best foot forward, not performing for that connection, but true, authentic expression of who I am and being received as that, like that connection. If I get connection through only putting my best foot forward, guess what? That is a vulnerable place for me to be, because I can't afford to show the bits that I know that I've got, but I'm not willing to show. So just that connection, being fully come as you are.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying that you have to kind of work for that. You know, come as you are, yes, but you have to find the right people, because not everybody will be that accepting. You know, whether you're looking inside religion or outside or anywhere else, that's just a reality of human behavior. So when people ask me, but Mimi, how do I overcome loneliness? You know, one of the things I say to them is, well, the only person that can do it is you.
Yes.
So I fully agree with you about that authentic whole self. It doesn't have to only be when your best foot is forward. It has to be when any foot is forward. But you also have to be aware of putting yourself in environments, you know, perhaps that is, for example, within a church, in this case, to find people that are willing to accept, you know, or it might be that you need to change the school that your child is in, or you may be in the wrong organizational culture, right? So that awareness of finding the right place to solve your loneliness, to find your connection, is also a conscious one. And I think it's important to say that, because otherwise what happens is people will sit at home and blame themselves and find themselves very vulnerable, and also just blaming a million other things, when actually a shift in context can be a hugely important part of that acceptance.
I have a word here at Always Betting Yesterday. It's called heartprint, and the word really symbolizes the impact, the ripple effect that we leave in other people. And you are only really just getting started. Like, you're only just the wave of the ripple that you've put out is both big, but it's going to be a generational impact, right? And I'd love for you to take a moment to reflect as to what you hope that heartprint will be.
Oh, that's a big question. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's very similar to the answer to the question when you said, you know, if everybody had more connection, what would you see? What I know from the work that I do, from the time that I'm on stage, and it's quite, I don't know, quite emotional, but also quite powerful what you say, you know, you're only just getting started, because I am actually only just learning this as I go. But what I know from those moments that I'm on stage is something changes in the audience, but it also changes in me. Every time I do them, every time the audience gets bigger. I just had around 5,000 people last week. It's a lot of people, right? You have to look kind of 180 degrees to see them all. Every time I do another one, I can feel the shift in the people around me and the people around the room. So if I'm going to think about what that heartprint is, it would be more of that. It would be simply by turning up, me, yes, but all of us, by turning up into rooms of people, we can create incremental change in those rooms, and increasingly into societies and countries and the world. It is contagious. Empathy is contagious. There's no doubt about it. That's why I mentioned reverse empathy right at the beginning.
Mm.
When I lean in and understand you, the reverse will happen. If not immediately, it will happen. That's why now for me, for example, and it's, you know, it's a wonderful thing, but it also takes a lot of time. But wherever I go, literally wherever I go, people talk to me. And they go from very quickly saying something mundane to, like, you know, going somewhere else. When you listen, when you go through your life listening, all kinds of connectivity occurs, and that is so beneficial for people, for children, for teenagers, for reversing suicide rates, all kinds of things. And I hope that that heartprint does that. I hope that we teach enough people to be aware enough and able and open enough to listen, that we're creating that kind of impact, not just in those micro moments, one-on-one, but en masse.
I love that. I do have a deeper faith, and part of that faith says that you know, you choose your calling on your life, you accept the mission that God's put on your heart, and when you do that, we become a physical manifestation of, like, God is a source, is a spirit, right? But it requires human beings to enact that. It's this idea that you know, if you pray for something, God will send a friend, because we are the human expressions of that to one another, right? So when you're sat there with your God's calling on your heart around listening, well, guess what? Of course, you're going to attract people at the need of it, who just need at their core to be heard. So,
I
yeah,
love that.
yeah, you know, it's your own fault, my friend. I'm sorry about that. You decided to take up the calling on your life, and guess what? There's a
I
lot of people
did.
who need it. So you're doing
I
God's
did,
work.
and I love it. I love it. I mean, I do. As I said, it is a wonderful, wonderful reality. I'll tell you one very short story just to bring that to life, because it's a beautiful one. At an event recently, again in the Middle East, because I work a lot in the Middle East, but I speak at a very corporate event, Ryan, 500 HR leaders, very senior, very corporate. It was in oil and gas, so very hard industry. And at the end of this speech, which is fundamentally about leadership and, you know, the future of HR, but in this realm, this gentleman like beelines for me. And again, you know, I'm in very, very sort of conservative and respectable, but Western clothes. He's in, you know, very local clothes to his region, man versus woman, West versus East, Muslim versus non, all of these things, right? That no issue for me, but they often create some level of gap between human beings, right? Because that's how we live. So he comes to me, he beelines to me, and he says, you know, thank you for your speech, Mimi. I want to tell you something. I said, absolutely. He says, I think I've made a really big mistake. And I was like, oh, right. You know, you're in the middle of a corporate event. And I said, oh, you know, okay, well, please go ahead. And he said to me, Mimi, yesterday, my teenage son came home and he had bad grades. And I shouted at him. And I think I really hurt him. And only now did I realize, listening to you, that I never asked him why. So, with your permission, I'm going to leave this event. I'm going to go and pick him up from school, which in the country where this happened is quite a rare occasion for the man to do that. I'm going to go and pick him up from school, and I'm going to take him for food, for dinner, and I'm going to ask him why. And the next day, he sent me a WhatsApp, and he said, I wanted to tell you that I did take my son out for dinner. I did ask him why, and I think you may have changed our family forever. So when you talk about, I know, right? I wrote about it in my new book because I'll never forget it. Particularly because our cultures are so extremely different. You know, so talking about overcoming gaps, overcoming cultural differences, overcoming religious differences, gender difference, I mean, every difference. So to your point, when you listen to people, they listen on. And that does change the world, because now maybe his son will behave totally different to the next generation when he becomes a father or a teacher or a leader. So I don't know if it's God's work or not. I love that you say it is. I hope that it is. And I hope that that ripple effect continues.
Well, to clarify what I meant by you only just getting started, I wasn't referring to the amount of time that you've put in, because I know this is decades worth of your heart work. What I mean is that generational example. So I understand that I think children interact with 80,000 people in a lifetime. So one parent with one child, it naturally affects 80,000 people in a lifetime because of their parenting. And I think that's what I mean about the generational ripple effect is, that's just one interaction, right? So we are currently in the process of serving the people around us and in front of us. But I really have this belief that our true beneficiaries of our work are not those who are our clients. They're everybody who receives our client. So you work with a CEO, you work with a parent, you work with a father. The true beneficiaries are everyone who comes into contact with that newly empathic human being.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. I want to be super respectful of your time. Mimi, thank you so much for all that you do, all that you bring to the world. I'll make sure all your links are in the show notes, and I'd be honored if you'd leave us a final thought from your good self.
Oh gosh, well, I think my final thought would go back to one of our middle thoughts, which is around this idea of we're all more alike than we are different. And I think sometimes you just need a mindset shift to find that. And if you are feeling alone, if you are feeling lonely, if you are feeling like people don't understand you, perhaps take a moment to consider that and look at how you might listen to others, understand others, reach out to others, and just watch that kind of miraculous ability of serving others and therefore fulfilling your own needs. Back to that point of, we are more alike than we are different. You are absolutely not alone. There will be someone somewhere, probably many someones, feeling exactly like you. And that empathy ripple effect, I promise you, it's real because I see it every day.
Mimi, thank you so much.
Hey my friends, thank you for making it to the end. I hope that our time spent together today has left you a little bit better than before you push play. I'd really appreciate if you just took a moment to leave a review to allow me to meet more people where they are and hopefully leave them a little bit better too. If you're curious to know how I, through Always Better Than Yesterday, can serve you, your team, your organisation, then head to alwaysbetterthanyesterday.com to connect. And while you're there, let me know one or two things that you're going to do as a result of listening to this conversation. I absolutely love hearing your thoughts, your reflections, and the things that this spark in your own heart and mind. If you want more insights from my heart and mind, I do send out short episodes on a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday and Friday, and again, I hope that they serve you well. I appreciate you listening. I'm Ryan Hartley, host of the Always Better Than Yesterday podcast, a podcast for heart-centered leaders just like you. Keep leading, my friends. Always love.